In the first arguments lecture, we took a broad, comprehensive look at arguments, inferences, and their interrelationships. We want to take that background information now, keep it in mind as we narrow our focus specifically to the topics in Rachel's chapter. The storyboard for this lecture has two elements. As we transition into Rachel's chapter specifically, we'll want to look at this quote with which he begins this chapter. Philosophy without argument would be a lifeless exercise. You might want to stop the video for a second and think to yourself how it is you think you should understand this quote from Rachel's. Then, once you've made up your mind, start the video again and compare your thoughts to the way in which I structure the lecture. How do I want to structure our discussion about this quote? We want to explore and understand how Rachel's understands this statement. We'll start by talking about his emphasis of giving reasons and having reasons in ethics. Then we'll turn our attention to giving reasons and having reasons understood in light of arguments, and specifically in light of the role of inferential claims relating the truth of premises to the truth or likely truth of conclusions. And then we'll turn our attention to two ways to go about evaluating an argument as providing reasons to accept, either as definitely true or as highly likely, the conclusion of a particular argument in the context of ethics itself. We'll look at evaluating an argument for its soundness, specifically for the truth or falsity of its premises, and we'll look at evaluating an argument, specifically a deductive argument, for validity or invalidity, for having that relationship expressed in the inferential claim such that if the premises are true, the conclusion is guaranteed to be true. Once we've looked at these two different ways to evaluate an argument, then we'll turn our attention to the two examples of arguments and evaluations thereof that we find in Rachel's chapter here. These arguments both concern the viability, the truth or likely truth of a doctrine called moral skepticism. So we'll discuss what moral skepticism is, and then we'll look at the first argument, which he calls the provability argument, and we'll look at how he evaluates the provability argument. He will evaluate the provability argument by claiming that the argument is unsound, specifically that the premises are not all true. Then we'll turn our attention to the second argument that he calls the cultural differences argument. Both of these arguments are arguments for moral skepticism. He rejects the first because the premises are not true. He rejects the second argument that we'll look at because he claims the argument is invalid. The deductive inferential claim relating the truth of the premises to the truth of the conclusion is violated. It's possible for the premises to be true without guaranteeing that the conclusion is true. Let's pivot now to that first bullet point under our quotation and talk about giving reasons and having reasons. Let's start with Rachel's emphasis on the idea of giving reasons. And specifically, what we want to look at is this idea that arguments provide a vehicle for constructive debate. For Rachel's, arguments provide us with a structured, disciplined way of giving reasons and of having reasons. When we think about ethical beliefs, or ethical choices, or ethical principles, one of the things that we'll notice is that people's beliefs, their choices, their principles, and even their ethical judgments often conflict with one another. That is, one culture's ethical principles may differ or even contradict the ethical principles of another culture. Different individuals may have conflicting views about the rightness or wrongness of a particular action, say cheating on one's taxes. When such conflicts occur, we need a vehicle by which to mediate that conflict when we interact with each other. Having a vehicle for conflict resolution is particularly important in areas like ethics, because ethical properties, like being a right action or a wrong action, aren't the sort of properties that we can see or smell or taste or otherwise established through direct empirical tests. So for example, if I want to decide whether or not a liquid is acidic or base, I can stick a piece of litmus paper into that liquid, and depending upon the color the paper turns, I get an answer, a fact that I can visualize. I can see that this is an acidic liquid. I can see that this is a base liquid. If I want to know the temperature of my morning coffee, I can stick a thermometer in that coffee and measure that specific fact about the nature of the world. In ethics, we sometimes naively think that we have the ability to see or to measure such facts like the rightness or wrongness of an action or an ethical principle. For instance, we may have a strong emotional reaction to some action. We might say, see someone torturing animals for their own amusement. We might have a very strong negative emotional reaction to that behavior. I think lots of people will. But there's nothing about your seeing that action and having that feeling that provides you with an intersubjectively reliable way of determining the moral abhorrence or lack thereof of that action. For instance, a significant number of people don't have that negative emotional reaction to animal cruelty. So how do we go about figuring out what properties apply to actions, choices, or principles in the ethical realm if we don't just have a mechanical way of testing for their presence or absence in some particular case? We find Rachel ends this chapter by talking about how we have to be careful to temper our emotional responses to situations by reasons. We have to be able to justify our judgments, not just feel them. Similarly, lots of people will have intuitions about something being ethically right or ethically wrong. So you may see somebody picking on a poor, helpless school kid, and you'll have an intuition, well, that's a bad person. Those intuitions, much like feelings, may be correct or they may be incorrect, but quite often people will differ in their intuitions, just as they differed in their feelings. And we'll see that when we look at complex, difficult, out of the ordinary cases, people's intuitions oftentimes conflict. Thus, unlike more straightforward properties in nature, like, say, temperature, we don't have a simple operation or an observation that allows us to agree upon the ethical status of some action. Because we don't just have tags on actions and choices and beliefs that tell us they're ethically good or they're ethically bad, we must come up with alternative ways of determining the presence or absence of ethical praiseworthiness or of ethical blameworthiness. Rachel tells us that giving reasons, presenting arguments for our ethical beliefs, ethical choices, and ethical principles provides us with a vehicle for engaging with people with whom we may disagree, allowing us to constructively interact with them. Arguments provide the basis for converging on agreement or coming to the truth. In particular, presenting arguments for your view is crucial in interacting with people because it allows us to defend our beliefs or our choices or our actions, even to persuade people who may initially disagree with us. So our ability to articulate our reasons allows us to defend ourselves against criticism. It allows us to understand the reasons why we do things and why other people do things. It allows us a constructive means by which to persuade others without resort to brute force. Giving reasons, therefore, serves this crucial function of mediating conflict and working towards intersubjective agreement. Likewise, as we discussed in the first lecture, arguments provide a permanent objective record of an argument as a model for an inference, so that we can evaluate the argument and we can determine whether it models a good inference. We can look at the premises and see if they really are true or if they express statements that we take to be true. We can look at the inferential claim and see if the inferential claim really is successful. If it's a deductive argument, we can be confident that if the premises are true and the argument is valid, it really is the case that the conclusion has to be true. So arguments allow us to evaluate our ethical views and decide whether particular arguments give us good reasons for adopting or rejecting a particular belief or course of action. When we think about having reasons as well as giving reasons, we realize that arguments therefore can help us to make more systematic, principled, and fair ethical choices. In the next lecture module, we'll shift our attention from giving reasons and having reasons to how we might respond to an argument when we disagree with its conclusion.